A tale of patience, care, and compassion. Jessie was exhausted, a fatigue that had settled into the bones, but she couldn't afford to let it show. The flight was about to depart, and everything needed to go smoothly. At least that's what she kept telling herself as she swiftly moved down the narrow aisles, ensuring passengers were buckled in and comfortable. Her eyes scanned the cabin, making sure all was in order. And then she saw him. Sam. He was sitting in his seat, bouncing excitedly, his hands flailing in the air as if he were trying to conduct an orchestra in the middle of the aisle. His little arms flapped up and down, mimicking the sound of a jet engine in a surprisingly accurate imitation of an airplane. "Sam," Jessie called out gently, a professional smile plastered across her face. She had seen this behavior many times before. Kids who were a little too energetic, their imaginations running wild as the plane prepared to take off. But Sam wasn't just mimicking an airplane, no. He was a force of nature in that tiny seat, his energy boundless, his enthusiasm contagious. But right now, that energy was anything but helpful. Sam's father, who had been half-heartedly watching his son, hadn't noticed yet that Jessie had walked over. His focus remained firmly on his laptop, likely unaware of how his son's antics were slowly starting to disrupt the atmosphere of the flight. "Sam," Jessie repeated, this time with a firmer tone, though still trying to maintain that sense of calm professionalism. "You need to sit down now and buckle your seatbelt, okay?" But Sam was lost in his own world. His little body was caught in the joy of his imagination, and for him, being told to sit down and be still was a foreign concept. Jessie had seen this before, children who couldn't understand why their freedom needed to be contained in such moments. She couldn't fault him for it, but she could feel her patience starting to fray. "Sam, please," she urged again, leaning closer, her hand reaching out to try and gently guide him back to his seat. But he twisted away from her grip, his little feet tapping rhythmically on the floor. A sense of frustration began to build inside her. She loved her job, and she loved working with people, especially children, but this was pushing it. She glanced around, noticing other passengers starting to look at her with expressions of concern and impatience. Jessie took a deep breath. Patience, she reminded herself. Patience. "Sam, it's really important that you sit down now," she said, her voice a little more authoritative but still kind. But Sam was not in the mood for listening. He was full of life, full of energy, and the impending flight was no match for his imagination. Jess's gaze shifted momentarily to the back of the plane, where she could see the cockpit door. The pilot was likely preparing for takeoff, and the clock was ticking. The last thing she wanted was to cause a delay over something as simple as a child refusing to sit down. But then, as if to prove her point, Sam stood up on his seat, his arms flapping wildly again, this time emitting an exaggerated whooping sound that was borderline ear-piercing. He seemed to be pretending to fly the plane himself, his little body leaning forward, pushing the limits of the seatbelt as he pretended to steer the aircraft. Jess's face hardened. She couldn't let this go on. She had tried patience. She had tried reasoning. And now it was time for action. Her steps were quick, purposeful, as she moved toward Sam's seat. This time, her voice rang out clearly. "Sam, sit down right now." The harshness of her tone caught him off guard, and his wide eyes blinked at her in shock. Sam immediately stopped moving and dropped back down into his seat. The sudden silence was almost deafening. Jessie let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had finally managed to get his attention, but at what cost? Sam sat quietly now, his arms folded in his lap, his lower lip pushed out in a pout. He wasn't happy, but at least he was compliant. Jessie turned on her heel, glancing over to Sam's father, who had finally pulled his eyes away from his laptop and was looking at her, confusion painted across his face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern, though he had not noticed the earlier exchange. Jessie pasted a smile on her face, the one she used with every passenger, the one she had perfected over the years. "Oh, everything's fine, sir," she said sweetly, though inside, she could feel her patience running thin. Just needed to make sure Sam stays seated until we take off. She walked away quickly, but not without stealing a glance back at the little boy who was now sulking in his seat. For a moment, Jessie felt a twinge of guilt. Was she too harsh? Maybe she had overreacted, but the flight needed to depart. There was no time to dwell on it. As the flight continued its preparations, Jessie continued her routine, offering water to passengers, checking safety equipment, and assisting with anything that needed her attention. Her mind, however, kept drifting back to Sam. His behavior hadn't been aggressive. It had been pure, unfiltered childlike joy. So why did it make her so frustrated? She walked past Sam's seat again, her heart softening at the sight of him. He was sitting quietly now, but his little hands were still restless, shifting around in his lap, as though they were anxious to move again. She saw a flash of red on his hands, a patch of irritated skin that hadn't been there before. Jess's heart skipped a beat. The rash. She had seen it when she had first asked Sam to sit down. At first, she thought it was just a rash from his constant scratching, but now that she saw it up close, she realized it was more than that. "Sam," she said gently, crouching beside him. Her earlier frustration melted away, replaced by concern. "Sweetie, can I see your hands?" Sam hesitated for a moment, but then, almost as though he sensed the change in Jess's tone, he extended his hands to her. Both palms were red, scratched, and irritated. They were clearly in distress, and Jessie's instinct told her this wasn't just some random itching. "Sam, are you okay?" she asked softly, her concern growing. Sam didn't answer, but he looked at her with wide eyes, and that was enough. Jess's heart ached. She could tell there was something wrong, something beyond the playful antics of an energetic child. This wasn't just about being a little stubborn. There was discomfort beneath his behavior. "Sir," Jessie called out again, her voice now filled with urgency. She caught the attention of Sam's father, who immediately closed his laptop, a frown forming on his face as he saw Jessie holding Sam's hands. She gently placed them in his father's hands. "I think there's something wrong with his hands," she explained, her words clear but tinged with concern. "His skin is red and irritated, and he's been scratching it nonstop." Sam's father, now visibly shaken, looked at his son's hands with growing worry. "Sam, what's going on?" he asked, his tone now serious. His earlier dismissal of Sam's behavior had quickly shifted to one of fatherly concern. But Sam, as if overwhelmed by the attention, pulled his hands back, wiggling away from his father's grasp. Jessie watched, her heart heavy. This wasn't just a case of misbehavior. Sam's actions were an outward sign of inner distress. The father, realizing the gravity of the situation, hesitated for a moment before speaking to Jessie. "Is it something that could get worse on the plane?" "I'm not sure," Jess replied, "but I think we should alert the pilot. It's possible he could be having an allergic reaction or something else." The father's face went pale. He hadn't thought it through. He hadn't realized how serious this could be. He'd been so focused on managing Sam's behavior that he hadn't seen the signs. "I'll take care of it," Jessie said, her voice firm and compassionate. She had seen enough to know when to step in. The safety and well-being of every passenger, especially the young ones, were her responsibility. And with that, Jessie rushed toward the cockpit, her mind already working out the best course of action. But as she walked, she realized something. This wasn't just about a rash or a child's behavior. This was about compassion, about recognizing the deeper needs of those around you. And sometimes it was in the moments of frustration that we learned the most about patience and care. Sam had taught her something that day. It wasn't just about getting the child to sit still or follow the rules. It was about understanding what lay behind the actions. And in the process, both Jessie and Sam's father were reminded that a little kindness, a little patience, and a little understanding went a long way in making the world a safer and more compassionate place. As the plane ascended into the sky, Jessie felt a sense of peace. They were in the air, but more importantly, they were all a little closer to understanding. The power of understanding. The cabin was now eerily quiet, the steady hum of the engines below filling the space as the aircraft soared higher into the sky. Jessie stood at the front of the plane, her eyes scanning over the passengers, the routine of her work briefly forgotten. She found herself lost in thought, replaying the earlier moments in her mind. Sam's sudden distress, the way his hands had looked, the concern in his father's eyes. It all left a heavy weight on her heart. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. She had seen too many children with small issues, some of which could easily be ignored or brushed aside. But Sam wasn't one of those children. There was something deeper going on, something that couldn't be solved by mere patience or a few firm words. Jessie knew this was more than a simple misbehavior or a reluctance to follow instructions. There was pain behind Sam's restlessness, and she couldn't just walk away from it. Her fingers brushed against the back of her neck, a sign that the tension in her body was still there, even if she had tried to suppress it. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that was weighing on her. It was the emotional one. The kind of exhaustion that only comes when you realize there is something you should have done but didn't. Something important that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The voice of the captain came over the intercom, breaking her reverie. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. We'll be passing through a bit of turbulence shortly, so please keep your seatbelts fastened. If you need anything, feel free to let one of our crew members know." Jessie gave a small nod, instinctively adjusting her uniform and heading toward the back of the plane. She couldn't sit still. She needed to check on Sam again. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed that Sam was no longer flapping his arms or making airplane sounds. His small frame was hunched in his seat, his hands tucked under his chin, his expression distant. He looked like he was lost in thought, no longer the energetic boy from earlier, but something else entirely. Jessie approached him slowly, her movements cautious, as if approaching a bird with a broken wing. "Sam?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. He didn't look up at her. His eyes were focused on his hands, still red and irritated, but there was no longer any sign of the playful energy she had seen earlier. Instead, he looked exhausted, both mentally and physically. "Sam, can I help?" Jessie asked gently, her heart heavy with the knowledge that something was wrong. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine anymore. The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide and filled with confusion. He hadn't expected to be asked if he needed help. He was used to being told to sit still, to be quiet, to conform. But Jessie wasn't asking him to do any of that. She was simply offering her care, her concern. "I think I need to go to the bathroom," Sam muttered quietly, his voice small and uncertain. Jessie nodded immediately. She could see that he wasn't fully able to communicate what was happening to him, but at least he was acknowledging his discomfort. "All right, let's get you to the bathroom." "Okay," she said as she stood up, offering him her hand. Sam hesitated for a moment, his body tense. But then, as though the gesture of kindness had unlocked something inside him, he took her hand. His tiny fingers gripped hers with an almost desperate urgency, as if he was afraid that if he let go, he might lose the chance to express whatever was bothering him. Jessie guided him down the aisle, her steps deliberate but steady. She didn't want to rush him. This wasn't just about helping him to the bathroom. It was about understanding. Something was happening, and Jessie wasn't going to let Sam go through it alone. As they reached the bathroom door, Jessie gave Sam a reassuring smile. "Take your time." "Okay. I'll be right here." Sam nodded, his eyes flickering with a mixture of gratitude and unease. He stepped into the small space, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Jessie alone in the hallway. Her mind began to race. What was happening to Sam? She had seen children with simple allergies before, kids with rashes or scratches. But the way Sam had reacted, his refusal to let his father touch his hands, the way he clung to her for help, it wasn't normal. She thought back to the moments when she had first seen Sam's hands. The red, irritated skin. The frantic scratching. She wondered if it was something beyond a mere allergy. Was he in physical pain? Was there something else going on inside him? Something that made him act out, to withdraw from his father and those around him. The sound of the bathroom door opening snapped her from her thoughts. Sam emerged, looking a little more composed, but still carrying that same burden in his eyes. He walked back to his seat, this time with a quieter, more solemn demeanor. Jessie followed him back to his spot, her mind still buzzing with questions. But as she looked at Sam, she realized that the answers weren't going to come easily. Sometimes, understanding wasn't about having all the facts. Sometimes, it was about being there for someone when they needed you, even if you didn't know how to fix everything. Sam settled back into his seat, his posture a little more slumped than before. Jess bent down beside him again, offering him a soft smile. "How are you feeling now?" she asked, her voice low and comforting. Sam didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced at his father, who was watching from the aisle seat. The father had seemed so distant earlier, absorbed in his laptop, disconnected from his son's needs. But now, as Sam met his gaze, Jessie saw something shift in the father's expression. It was a softening, a realization, perhaps, that he hadn't been fully present for his son. The father leaned forward, his voice quieter now, filled with regret. "Sam, I'm sorry I didn't pay attention earlier. I didn't know something was wrong. Can you tell me what's bothering you?" For a long moment, Sam didn't speak. His hands were still clutched tightly in his lap, his fingers twitching nervously. But then, slowly, he lifted his eyes to meet his father's. "My hands hurt," Sam finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "They'd been hurting for a while, but I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to worry you." The father's face went pale. Jessie felt a pang in her chest. She could see it now, the underlying cause of Sam's distress. It wasn't misbehavior. It wasn't stubbornness. Sam had been hurting for a long time, and he hadn't known how to express it. The father reached out cautiously, his hand trembling slightly as he gently took his son's hands into his own. "Sam, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have seen it." Sam didn't pull away this time. Instead, he let his father hold his hands, the father's touch tender and full of remorse. For the first time on this flight, Sam's face softened. There was no more resistance, no more need to act out. He just wanted to be understood. Jessie stepped back, giving them space. She had done what she could. But now, it was clear that this moment needed to belong to the father and son. She had helped them find their way back to each other, and that was all she could do. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, Jessie felt a quiet sense of peace settle in her chest. She had witnessed a moment of healing, one that had nothing to do with medicine or procedures, but with something much more powerful: understanding. Sometimes the answers didn't come all at once, but sometimes all it took was someone to listen. And in that moment, Jess realized that the most important part of her job wasn't just to keep the passengers comfortable or safe. It was to be there for them when they needed it the most. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that Sam had taught her something valuable. The world could often be a confusing and overwhelming place, but through compassion and understanding, we could make it a little easier for each other. And in that small, shared moment between a flight attendant and a child, Jessie knew that she had made a difference. A journey of healing. The plane had leveled out, cruising steadily at 35,000 feet, yet Jessie felt as if she had been transported to a different space altogether. The hum of the engines had become a soft background noise, almost meditative, as the weight of the day's events settled on her shoulders. It wasn't the first time she had encountered a child struggling mid-flight, but something about Sam's situation had struck a chord deep within her. There was a story unfolding beyond the surface, and for once, Jessie didn't feel like an observer. She felt like a part of it. As she moved back through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and smiling in passing, her eyes kept drifting to Sam. The boy was quiet now, his earlier restlessness replaced by a sort of calm. though it was the kind of calm that still carried a hint of vulnerability. Sam was no longer engaged in his playful imitations or the wild flapping of his arms. He was sitting with his hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes cast downward, as though lost in the weight of his thoughts. His father, sitting beside him, seemed to share the same heavy silence, a look of deep contemplation clouding his face. Jess didn't know what was happening with Sam, but one thing had become undeniable. This was more than a simple case of a child being difficult on a plane. Sam wasn't just bored or afraid of flying. He was struggling with something deeper, something he hadn't been able, or perhaps hadn't felt safe enough, to share. And in that moment, Jess realized that it was up to her to help create a space where he could open up, not just to his father but to the world around him. As Jessie paused in the aisle, a quiet thought entered her mind. Healing was often not about fixing problems. It was about creating understanding, patience, and a willingness to sit through the discomfort of not having immediate answers. Sam's father, too, had been a part of this delicate moment of healing, but his journey was just beginning. He had been caught in the whirlwind of his son's behavior, unaware of the deeper currents pulling at Sam. Now, it seemed, he was starting to realize how important it was to be present in a way he hadn't been before. But Jess could see the guilt beginning to creep in. The father didn't yet know how to navigate this new awareness, but Sam did. She was still processing her own reflections when the captain's voice broke through again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now entering some turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated. This will pass quickly." As the plane shifted slightly in the air, the announcement prompted a series of murmurs from the passengers. Some were jolted awake, some barely noticed, and some glanced around in mild anxiety. Jessie made her way to the back of the cabin to reassure passengers, but her thoughts kept circling back to Sam. She reached the end of the plane, where the galley doors were closed for privacy, and turned to face the aisle, eyes scanning the passengers. The turbulence made the usual rounds of drinks and snacks less smooth, and Jessie found herself working quickly to maintain her composure. The sudden, unexpected shift in the plane's movements served as a reminder that life was unpredictable, just like Sam's behavior had been earlier. It was a subtle nudge that reminded her how little control we often have over the things that matter most. A brief moment of calm returned as the plane steadied, and Jessie found herself again walking down the aisle. As she passed Sam's seat, she couldn't help but notice that his father had finally leaned in, speaking softly to him. The man's voice was low, full of tenderness now, no longer harsh or distracted. Sam, though still quiet, was listening. He had a slight, almost imperceptible nodding of his head, as though he were absorbing his father's words. Jessie smiled to herself as she continued on her way, knowing that this was a moment that Sam's father would remember. It was a moment of connection, one that they hadn't shared before, not in this way. And for Sam, the feeling of being truly heard was a gift that could carry him through far more than any specific incident. Jessie knew that their relationship was beginning to shift in ways that couldn't be seen at the surface. But the change was happening, and that was all that mattered. Hours passed, and the journey continued. Jess's duties carried her up and down the aisles, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the flight. The passengers were still in their seats, some reading, others napping, and a few even engaging in light conversation. But everything seemed quieter, more thoughtful. Perhaps it was just her, but she had the distinct sense that the energy had changed. Sam was no longer sitting with his head down, sulking in silence. Instead, he was quietly talking to his father, showing him something on the screen of his tablet. Sam's earlier irritability had faded, and in its place was a new sense of connection. A bond was starting to form, one built on understanding and a shared willingness to face discomfort. At one point, Jessie passed by and noticed that Sam was laughing softly at something his father had said. It was a beautiful sound, the kind of laugh that seemed to break through the tension in the air like a ray of sunlight piercing through clouds. Sam's laughter wasn't the loud, wild giggling of a child merely playing. It was a sound of relief, a momentary release of the strain he had been carrying. Jessie paused for a moment, standing off to the side, watching them interact. She could see it now, the transformation. The father was no longer merely reacting to his son's behavior. He was listening to him, understanding him in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a step forward, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gift a parent could give their child was their full presence. Jessie had seen many families before, each with its own dynamics. There were families where the bond seemed effortless, and others where the distance was palpable. And then there were those like Sam and his father, where the connection was still a work in progress, but a progress that was unmistakably real. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't even know if she had helped in any significant way. But she knew that for this family, the journey they were on wasn't just about a flight from one place to another. It was about the journey of healing, a process that, while messy and imperfect, was deeply human. And if there was anything Jessie had learned in her years as a flight attendant, it was this: the greatest connections aren't always made in the moments of perfection. Sometimes they're made in the quietest, most unexpected of exchanges, the moments when you're simply there for someone, without judgment, without a rush to fix everything. As the flight neared its final descent, Jessie looked down at the cabin once more. Sam and his father were no longer the focal point of the chaos that had once surrounded them. They were now simply a father and son, together in the quiet, building the kind of understanding that could carry them far beyond this moment. The pilot came on the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into our destination. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for landing." Jessie moved back toward the front, her heart a little lighter than it had been when she first stepped on the plane. She had witnessed something rare, something beautiful. The power of understanding, the healing that comes when two people choose to truly connect with each other, especially in the moments when it's hardest to do so. For Jessie, the journey was just as important as the destination, and she knew that for Sam and his father, this flight would be remembered not for the turbulence or the delays, but for the way they had found each other once again. Through patience, presence, and compassion, they had taken a step toward healing that would echo far beyond this plane ride. And as the wheels touched down on the runway, Jessie couldn't help but smile. Some flights, she realized, were never truly over. They just continued, in ways that were deeper than any altitude could reach. The journey beyond the sky. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, signaling the end of another long journey, Jessie couldn't help but reflect on the remarkable experiences that had unfolded within the walls of this metal vessel. Passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing for the final step of their journey. The once tense atmosphere had faded, replaced by a sense of calm and quiet satisfaction. And in that moment, Jess realized that the true power of a journey was not found in reaching the destination, but in the way we respond to each other along the way. Sam and his father, now standing in the aisle and collecting their bags, shared a quiet exchange, their eyes meeting with a newfound understanding. The father, once distant and distracted, now walked beside his son with a sense of closeness that hadn't existed when they first boarded the plane. Their earlier struggles, while not fully resolved, had softened into something more manageable, something they could build on. Jessie watched them with a sense of contentment, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of attention and compassion can bring about the biggest transformations. As the last passengers exited the aircraft, Jessie lingered by the door, offering one last smile to each person who passed. She was tired, physically drained, but emotionally fulfilled. She had given them more than just the routine tasks of a flight attendant. She had given them a space to connect, to understand, and to heal, often without even realizing it. And that was the lesson that Sam and his father had taught her today. Healing isn't always about quick fixes or dramatic resolutions. Sometimes it's about taking the time to listen, to be present, and to acknowledge the pain or struggle someone else might be going through. It's in the quiet moments, the subtle shifts, the way we choose to respond when we are at our most vulnerable, that real connections are made. We all carry burdens, some of which are visible and others hidden deep within us. But in our moments of distress, we are given an opportunity to either shut ourselves off from those around us, or to open up, to share, and to allow others to offer their understanding and care. The journey may be difficult, but the reward is found in the connections we create along the way. As Jessie walked off the plane, the weight of the day finally settled into her bones, but she knew that the experiences she'd shared, the small moments of compassion and understanding, would stay with her long after this flight had ended. She didn't need grand gestures or profound answers. She just needed to be there for others when they needed it most. And in the end, isn't that what all of us need? The flight had ended, but for Sam, his father, and Jessie, their journey of connection, healing, and understanding would continue long after they left the terminal. For each of them, the real flight was not the one they had taken in the sky, but the one they had started in their hearts, the journey that transcended turbulence, stretched beyond delays, and carried them towards something far more significant than any destination could offer: the power to truly understand one another. As the sun began to set behind the terminal, Jessie felt a quiet peace settle in her soul. The plane had landed, but her heart was still soaring. And that was enough.